So hi Matt, welcome to Kelly's Heroes Voices of Hope podcast. Very much looking forward to our conversation today and looking to find out more about you, the work that you do, and obviously your experiences of mental well-being. So to kickstart the podcast, if you could just introduce yourself to our listeners and just explain the type of role that you currently do.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley, and thank you for having me. So Matt Coleman, I'm the Deputy Chief Executive Officer at the Nene Education Trust, which is a family of 8 schools in North Northamptonshire, 1 secondary and 7 primary phase schools, serving the community of sort of East Northants, Raunds, that side of Wellingborough, Rushden, and then surrounding villages. And yeah, my job is to oversee the schools, their school improvement, and to make sure we're doing the very best we can for the young people that attend our schools.
Awesome. So it sounds like quite a busy role, quite a senior leadership role. How do you manage and cope with the stresses of your job, your well-being, and ensuring that you're remaining resilient with, I imagine, the amount of stuff that you have to deal with?
So the truth is, sometimes I don't. You're right, it's a big responsibility, but what I try to do and what we try to do with the leaders in our organisation is to reframe responsibility as privilege. So we're in a very privileged position in that we can influence and impact on the next generation of young adults coming through. So from my perspective, I've done an awful lot of work on myself over the past probably 15, 20 years to get myself to a place where the most high stress times I'm not crumbling. My wife would tell you that I'm still not the best at dealing with everything. And often it's at home when the true reality of emotions come out and how you're really feeling is shown. I guess as a privileged leader, again, using that word privilege, I feel like I have a duty to the people that I serve and the people that I work with. So my job to them is to try and be as calm and as connected and as stable as I possibly can, whilst also maintaining the fact that I'm a human being who gets things wrong. We're perfectly imperfect and we mess up. So showing that vulnerability, showing that I can be emotionally intelligent, showing that you care. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So there's a whole load of things there. But in terms of sort of strategies, I guess, and the work I've done on myself, I try ever so hard to stay present and stay in the moment, to not catastrophize, to deliberately depersonalize things. So, often you can think that something is said or something happens and that's just aimed at you and it's about you. And actually, you kind of depersonalize and step back from it. And the big thing, I think, and this is a big learning for me over the past sort of year to 18 months, is that there is so much that happens out there, so much that happens that is out of our control.
Absolutely.
So, and again, it's a cliche, but control the controllables. There's very little in my circle and my sphere of influence. Actually, there's very little I can control. I'm in control of how I respond to something or how I react or how I emotionally deal with something. But so much other stuff happens that I can't have any influence over. So I just try to make sure that I'm really realistic around the things that I can control, particularly in this position of sort of high pressure, high stress, high responsibility.
And that's a really interesting point. It was something that I was circling in my head when you were talking about it, is obviously you said over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, you've had massive transformation yourself. Like, what were the key things, or what was the trigger point, I guess, through those times that made you realise that, you cannot control everything and there has to be a certain level of acceptance of those things? But what was the sort of tools or things that, I don't know, that, as I said, triggered you to, being a bit easier on yourself in some of those situations?
Yeah, I think, look, I'm, again, in the interest of being wholly transparent, I haven't always found managing my own mental health that easy. In fact, it's been the thing that I've struggled with the most since my late teens. So growing up, and you kind of have this vision particularly as a man, I think, that you should be, the hunter-gatherer and you provide, etc. So you get into your early 20s and you start in the world of work, you start developing a career. And I know I did. I put an awful lot of pressure on myself. But at the same time, I wasn't able to necessarily differentiate sort of this idea of career progression and connection and whatever else and family time with actually how do I support my own mental well-being? How can I look after myself? So I've and I kind of joke about this now, but it isn't necessarily sort of it's not really a joking matter. I've been through quite a lot of different counsellors or therapists. You've probably got a little black book of people who have tried to help me.
Yeah.
And there have been some brilliant people along that journey. But I think the big thing that I particularly do now is that I surround myself with really, really good people who I can trust. So call them mentors or often elders, people who have sort of they've been through that journey. Because as I said, as a young 20-something coming into a high-pressured environment and a high-pressure career, there's so much you don't know. You know, now I'm sort of 15 years down the line, there's still loads that I don't know. But I was only reflecting yesterday with a friend of mine about how, we're both in our sort of just getting to that 40-year-old point and how different our perspectives on life are. But yeah, that key thing for me is actually taking the time to connect with good people who have got really strong life experiences, who can sometimes step back and kind of just be a bit wise and help you to see things a bit differently. And when the pace of life is so fast, taking that time is really important.
Absolutely. And that totally resonates with me. Similar to you, early 20s, in a career, just really wanted to drive forward. You climb the ladder, earn more money, all that sort of stuff. And the material things were so important to me. It's like, okay, great, I've got a new car. I've bought a house. I was only 19 when I bought my first property. Like, I thought, okay, I'm smashing this. And it was only till I maybe got to like my late 20s, I looked back and was like, wow, I haven't actually experienced anything, but also I'm not actually that happy. Yes, right. I might go on a couple of holidays a year, or I might do this sort of stuff, but it wasn't actually until that point I was like, okay, this isn't actually working for me.
And none of that matters. Yeah. That's the thing. None of that matters because we're wired as human beings, we're wired for love and connection. And, we're empaths, we feel. That's what we do. And so much of the other superficial stuff, we spoke before we came on here about like the social media side of things and how, on social media posts, everyone's having the greatest time. But actually that picture doesn't tell the real truth. We're so caught up we can get ourselves so caught up in the material stuff. And quite frankly, it doesn't matter. It becomes wholly irrelevant. And the other thing to remember, again, perhaps this is a bit almost deep and philosophical, but it really helps me, is that we are wholly insignificant, really. There are 8 billion people on this planet. So, I go through my life, I suppose, and as a bit of a dreamer, I want to change the world. I want to leave a little dent. I want to make my mark. But the stark reality is, and this isn't me being defeatist or unambitious, there's probably very little I can do really to make that massive mark, because there's 8 billion other people out there. And, I look at myself and think, okay, so you get caught up in all these stresses and strains of stuff that really matters. Well, it actually really doesn't, but then the other side to it is when you think about that love and connection element, then we are wholly significant. That's what matters. The family connection, the friends, the colleagues that you have that really close bond with. That's what should be driving us.
Absolutely. And kind of on that point around the connection with colleagues as well. So obviously you've been through a phenomenal journey and transformation yourself. And based on the senior leadership role that you do have, like how important is it for you to, make those connections with colleagues, but also to, help them on their journey in terms of, learning about, the importance of well-being, one for themselves as educators, but obviously the effect then it has on the children and pupils that they then teach as well.
Yeah, so I think, it's a bit of a lazy statement to make in some ways, but within any sort of work environment, I guess, but probably particularly in the education sector, relationships are incredibly important. For me, to answer the first part of your question, so I line manage 7 phenomenal head teachers and then a school improvement team that I work with. I'm surrounded by fantastic colleagues in the organisation that I work. They are great people. and I class them as my friends.
Mm-hmm.
I class them as people who I'm very close to. But of course, I also have to hold them accountable for the job they're doing. Now, nobody goes into the sector, particularly into education, with young children coming through to do a bad job. So one of the things I tried to model is this idea of, actually, if you can have the mindset that everyone is doing their best with the resources they've got at that time and the knowledge they have, etc., that really helps. So that also helps with adverse situations. You might have someone who is underperforming or something isn't going quite right, but then if you flip it around and say, well, okay, maybe they're doing their best right now, but maybe they just haven't got the right skills or the right tools, or maybe they're just not cut out for it. And that clear is kind sort of approach. And I think when it then comes to supporting wellbeing and people's sort of general psychological fitness, again, in the workplace, I want to know from my boss what success looks like. So I don't mind being given clear boundaries and almost clear success criteria, clear targets, because I want to know I want to feel success. So tell me what it looks like. Be really clear with me, and because that's kind. But at the same time, value me and love me and trust me. Starting from that place of trust is something else that I always do. And I've had it said to me before, maybe it's a vulnerability or a weakness of mine that I'm perhaps a bit too trusting. But I'd rather come from a place of, I trust you and I value you and I believe that you're going to do the very best that you can. That empowerment, I think, allows people to flourish in more of a positive way.
And in terms of, like, obviously you said you've spoken about, tell me what success looks like as well. I think it's also important. Yes, you can achieve a success, but you also need to speak up and say, well, these are the things I'm going to need to enable me to do those things as well.
Sure. Yeah. So, and that level of self-reflection, I suppose, and that understanding of oneself and where your own super strengths are and where you're not so strong. So for instance, I know that, and this is through doing the work I've done on myself over a large chunk of time and the feedback that I receive, I know that my super strength is my ability to connect with people and do those things that I just talked about, make them feel loved and valued and heard. But one thing I'm not very good at is the systemizing of it, or maybe the paperwork side or the bureaucracy and stuff like that, because I just find that really tedious. But also I know there has to be I know I'm getting a bit detailed now, but there has to be a paper trail of the work you're doing. I'd far rather be doing the doing and making the connections and empowering people and trusting them and believing in them than sitting behind a laptop proving my worth, as it were. I try and work on the premise of 80% improve, 20% prove. I know we always have to prove our existence in some way, certainly in the workplace. But if we can spend 4/5, 80% of our time improving things, surely things are better there.
Yeah. And I just want to move on slightly because obviously you've worked in education for a very long time. So I just want to kind of know your experience as well with obviously working with young people as well. Obviously, I know education's changed a lot since I was in school 25 years ago. But do you notice a massive change in terms of, young people and their resilience and, the things that they face in this world? Because I feel like I don't recognise education as to the school that I was in. I think, as you said, we were speaking earlier, when I was at school, didn't have a mobile phone, didn't have online gaming platforms. So I'd go home from school, do my homework, or I'd tell my mum I did my homework, and then go out and play, games in the street and all that sort of stuff. But the world now, we're so connected, and young people are so connected to such things. Sure. So, what is the difference you've noticed in the time you've been?
Well, I suppose the way to so if we almost answer the question, are young people less resilient now than they were? And if I kind of think about it from that perspective, I think the world would have you believe that they are. That our young people nowadays, they lack resilience. They don't have the ability to persevere and all of those things. But my view is actually, I think that's really unfair. I don't think it's comparable. Because as you say, back in the day when there were no mobile phones and no social media, etc., you'd get him from school, you'd say hi to your mum or dad or parents or whatever, and then off you go to play.
Yeah.
And then you come home when it gets dark or when the street lights go on or whatever. That was how life was. I think our young people have to be hugely resilient in a different way that we probably don't truly understand.
Yeah.
And I heard something on a podcast the other day where I can't remember who it was said that we overparent now offline and we underparent online. And the reality of that is quite frightening. I've got two children, so I've got a 14-year-old and a 10-year-old. But when my daughter was 3 or 4 years old, she could use an iPad better than I could. So, and my kids, my 14-year-old son, he's so whizzy with everything. And we keep an eye on what he does and we check, but he could be pulling the wool over my eyes.
Yeah.
There's stuff that could be going on his phone that we don't know about. And that's the reality, because they're smarter than we are.
Yeah, absolutely.
They've grown up with it.
There's a huge generational gap.
But then
now,
that also means that they are exposed to things and experiences and probably in the online sphere that we wouldn't recognize or be able to understand whatsoever. So their resilience probably has to be different. So perhaps on the face of it, the stuff that someone of my generation would look at and almost be like, well, you need to be able to sort of find a way of dealing with that and show some strength. Well, maybe it's not that easy, because there's a lot of other things that we're not overly aware of that are going on as well.
Yeah. So in terms of obviously your experience in the educational world, how important is it to, try and teach young people about mental resilience, well-being, and what's your experience of that been?
So the simple answer to the first part of your question, how important is it? It's crucial.
Yeah.
It has to be. It runs alongside. Our schools are still exam factories. We could do a whole podcast on why schools are exam factories. And the bureaucracy and almost the unfairness of the school system, in that no matter what anyone says, it's still exam results and grades that hold schools accountable and say how well schools are performing. Schools don't get judged on how well they support young people's psychological fitness or their mental well-being. They don't get judged on how well they enable young people to connect with themselves and each other and society. But that element is crucial. So in terms of if I can give you some applied examples from our organisation and what we've done over a large chunk of time now. So if we go back to probably 2017, 2018, across our multi-academy trust, though, with our family of schools, we brought in, at the time, she was a mindfulness and wellbeing lead. So a part-time role, a couple of days a week, to roll out mindfulness programs for our children from the age range of 4 to 18, to make sure that they understood how those strategies to support themselves. That has since evolved. So if we fast forward 7 years into a role that is a mental health and wellbeing lead, it's 3 days per week. So it's increased in the time. In fact, it's a bit more than that often as well. And we have programs that run across all of our schools where we've partnered with a charity called Bounce Forward, who are based down in London, but they're also linked to the Harry Kane Foundation to roll out psychological fitness programs, but also through support and work with Kelly's Heroes as well, and getting advice and guidance there where needed. And certainly, probably, I'd say when things become extreme, we've got, I'd vouch for this charity every single hour of every day of the week in terms of the wonderful guidance and care and support that it offers, and the expertise that is needed. And we've, I'm sure we'll come later as to why that was particularly relevant at a certain example in one of our schools. But if I've kind of gone beginning to end, but if I come to the middle, so we were ahead of the curve in terms of supporting mental wellbeing. We knew it was something that had to happen. And then COVID came along. Now, what COVID did for our schools, or one of the outcomes of COVID, was that everybody in our sector, and rightly so, by the way, was talking about young people's mental health and wellbeing. Mm-hmm. It was almost like they hadn't done beforehand.
Yeah.
Which seems bizarre because it was still there beforehand. Actually, the mental health sort of pandemic or the psychological ill health pandemic began long before COVID did. COVID accelerated it, but it was there. It was coming. And it was coming for the reasons that we've touched on already. The social media elements, the fact that we're in a society now that is so different to the one we knew before. And we don't really know. Everything changes so quickly.
And there was a huge loss of connection.
And all of that as well.
Yeah.
So what we then saw was that the pandemic accelerated the mental health challenges, not just for young people, but for lots of us in society. Lots of adults found that time incredibly difficult. So then there was a real spotlight straight after, and rightly so, that began with government on let's put funding in and let's pour resource into supporting young people's mental well-being. So where we are now, and I'll lay it out straight, that we've got access to some great networks. For example, in our schools, there's things like the mental health support team, which actually began again before the COVID pandemic. And we were the first, my school when I was head teacher was the first school to trial it in Northants and to sort of be there on that working group to get it working out there in all the schools now. And now it's everywhere and it has a great impact. There are other organisations and charities and great people out there and great organisations supporting schools to improve young people's mental well-being. So it's talked about and it's there. However, it still isn't an important thing when it comes to what makes a school strong or not.
Yeah.
So we've just had an Ofsted inspection at one of our schools this week. Again, it becomes, unfortunately, it's one of the most unnatural and in some cases quite brutal experiences. But there's no recognition of what the schools are doing for young people in terms of developing their psychological fitness and their well-being, because it doesn't feature in the framework. We all know it matters, but the hoops we have to jump through, it's not a thing that kind of that takes prominence.
Yeah. And I was just going to quickly ask, because like you were saying, you were ahead of the curve in terms of some of the stuff you were doing for, introducing mental well-being back in like 2017, 2018. So in terms of like, did you face a lot of challenges in terms of like saying, okay, I want this kind of role and this is the thing that I want to do, based on the fact of like, where, local authorities or whatever were at that time? Was that quite a difficult thing for you to, push for that budget or whatever that may be?
It's interesting. Yeah. And yes is the answer actually, because it's the impacts of supporting with mindfulness or with well-being aren't overly tangible. So I talked earlier about this world that we're in where you have to prove your existence all the time. Well, it's very difficult for Amy, who's our wonderful mental health and wellbeing lead now, to necessarily prove impact, because whereas with an exam you can show I've gone from this grade to this grade, you can't. There's no real way of quantifying. I suppose there are like sliding scales you could use, but we're not going to quantify what is something that is quite a personal, emotional thing. How is your psychological fitness now? It was here and it is here. And we know that changes on an hourly or daily basis. So, the answer is absolutely yes. It has been something that when those sort of budget setting conversations come and when we're looking at structures, it's one that at times I've had to fight for, to say, no, this is absolutely vital. And we'd be going absolutely backwards if we weren't to have this role. And it's not just the role, but it's the culture and the mentality that comes with it. This matters to us, so we're going to add resource to it and add value in that area.
It's strange because I don't come from an education background. I used to work in financial services, but one of the large companies that I used to work for, similar sort of thing in terms of like trying to get that investment, and you'd always have to prove like what was the return on the investment, like how much money you're going to save, all that sort of stuff. Whereas like in the last year or so, there was a new branch added to that saying, no, this is actually just something that we just call doing the right thing.
Yeah, okay.
So like you can see that, you said some of the effects of post-COVID,
Sure.
like obviously in very different industries, like that ripple effect is starting to show as well. So it's quite interesting to hear that point of view. While we were talking previously, like you did mention that you'd had some experience with a student that was in one of the schools in your trust. I I just wondered if we could maybe talk a little bit more about that and
Sure.
what was your experience, obviously, how you've supported the family since that as well.
So it was 2022, so nearly 3 years ago, March 2022. We lost a lad called Callum who died by suicide. He was young, early teens, and I was Callum's head teacher through primary school, so I knew him since he was 4 years old. He wasn't my son. He wasn't. He's not my kid. But I knew him. I spent a lot of time with him through his primary years, and also when he was in his early years of secondary school as well. And losing him was the professionally and probably personally one of, if not the worst feeling I could ever imagine because of the circumstances, because he'd taken his own life, because of the decision that he made, that there was that was the only option available to him. And I vividly remember. I was to look over to Sherry. I vividly remember that first phone call I made. The first phone call I made when I found the news out was to Sherry, and she knew from the sound in my voice that something grave had happened, and I felt numb for weeks after that. Only because I'm a complete empath, and I couldn't compute the reality of it, I guess, is where I was with that. But I also knew that there needed to be a leadership response to this awful tragedy. So I stepped up, and I knew I was the right person to do that. So I put myself into that position to lead on the response, and to lead on the response in the best possible way. Regular communications with Callum's family, trying to make sure we got the right messages to the right people, while supporting in a caring and emotionally intelligent and supportive way. Just when I think back, the even the emotion that I feel now to that moment, I was standing in the head teacher's office at Manor School, and I was on the phone to Sherry, and I was just like, Sherry, this has happened. I don't know what to do. And thankfully we were guided very, very closely through the response. But it's nothing that's nobody's ever prepared to respond to something like that.
Absolutely not.
And I said earlier about surrounding yourself with good people who are there to help and guide. And I relied very heavily on that every step of the way. Fast forward a few years, and we're in a place now where the Department for Education if I fast forward, then I'll come back to the bit in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're in a strong place now where the Department for Education are actively listening to the calls we're making to have suicide awareness as part of the national curriculum, to have suicide awareness as part of the key and core safeguarding paperwork that schools have to comply to. So there's a document called Keeping Children Safe in Education, which is the Bible when it comes to safeguarding. But as things stand presently, suicide is mentioned once in that document, which is completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
In the world that we're in, where we know that sadly the statistics tell us it's increasingly prevalent, whether it's successful suicide, sort of people taking their own lives, or people trying and it not quite happening, or self-harm. We know the statistics are increasingly grave. So we've got to stand up and do something different. So we I suppose as a response to Callum's death, I through and in collaboration with his family and with Kelly's Heroes charity, we wanted to raise awareness and do something about it. So almost to use something so tragic as a force for good.
Yeah.
So we're very clear on wanting all staff across our trust, so all 450 members of staff across the Nene Education Trust received training from Sherry and the team in suicide awareness and almost response, ways to respond, but also signs to look for, and how to create a sort of a suicide safe community. That was the whole premise of the training program, with the idea that one day, and we will get there, that every school locally and nationally receives that training. Now the challenge with that, and we kind of alluded to it earlier, is in a different part of the conversation. The challenge there is that we're tackling a subject that we need to change hearts and minds there, and it's a taboo area.
Absolutely.
You know, I'm not numb to the sort of the conversation about suicide, but I talk about it now because I've had so many conversations about it over the past few years because of circumstances, as if it's quite just I've normalised it. You know, it's quite a black and white thing, I suppose. And you know, for example, if I'm standing on the sidelines watching my son play football, and you know, I remember an example from about a year and a half ago, and one of the other parents asked me about there'd been a news article and I'd been on the news and talking about the project we'd undertaken, and he asked me about it, and I started telling him, and he was really interested and really engaged. Two of the other dads just stepped right away.
Yeah.
And it was really clear there wasn't that they weren't in a space or in a place where they could comprehend that conversation. So where we're tackling the taboo, I suppose, or where there is a stigma attached, and that remains, and it absolutely remains, and you guys will be much more in the know as to how that looks and feels. It shouldn't stop us talking about it, and I'm incredibly driven to make sure that we, across the education sector in particular, do have that confidence to open our sort of minds up to it. It was difficult, and we had to handle, if we go back to that training program we rolled out, we had to handle it with real sensitivity. You know, there was a really clear sort of pre-training questionnaire to get people's thoughts and feelings. I made it abundantly clear that people were in a safe place and that we didn't want to make anybody feel uncomfortable. And I suppose what it has done is it's allowed us to create a culture where psychological fitness and talking about it is more sort of, it's more accepted, I suppose. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah, no, absolutely, that does. The only thing that you know struck with me as well is that obviously, as you said, it's 2022 is when Callum passed away. Obviously, like the initial few weeks and all that is very raw and all that sort of stuff, but you did a fantastic job in, you know, with Kelly's Heroes to get lots of training rolled out. I just wanted to know, how have you managed to keep driving all that stuff, because you've done a phenomenal amount of work since that time and still doing it now. Like, how have you managed to, keep, going ahead and making sure that everyone's refreshed on that sort of stuff? Like, it wasn't just an event or a moment in time that, that we need to continue.
Yeah, I think, do you want me to answer that sort of on a personal level? How have I managed it?
Yeah, well, absolutely.
I think because fundamentally, I know this is perhaps a bit of a throwaway statement because it matters so much.
Yeah.
I suppose when it comes down to it, the difference between life and death, what's more important?
Yeah.
So when it's about significance. So when you look at all of and this idea of perspective, so you kind of line everything up as kind of like as to what's important. And then for whatever reason, and we'll never truly know, Callum made the decision to take his own life and to do what he did. Well, nothing's more important than that. So, and the ripple effect that's had on his incredible family and the community as a whole, and and the school community. I was there. I could see that. So, that fundamentally is why the drive still remains. Now, I'll be completely honest here. There have been times where those closest to me, particularly my wife, has said to me, "Well, you've got to stop now. Like, you can't keep doing this because you're wearing it, and I can see it, and it's pulling you back, and it's weighing you down so much. And I am worried about you because I care about you, and this isn't all right. To sort of be on this crusade permanently. So again, there have been times where I've sort of very deliberately probably boxed it off and been like, okay, that's just gonna be there for a while.
To just take some distance.
That's right, and our distance, and that happened for there was probably a period of a few months where I did distance myself, and I was like, I just need to almost not go there right now. I mean, that compartmentalising is something I've learned how to do as I've grown up, because I never used to be able to get anywhere near doing that. If it was in my head, it was in my head, and that was it, and I couldn't find a way of parking it. But I keep coming back to the key driver, which is almost what else can be more important, when to a certain extent I know how it feels to be in a place where you feel so lonely or so hopeless, and there is sort of you don't know where next is.
Yeah.
I can have a degree of empathy with that. Therefore, I suppose there's a greater connection to it, and I feel like I can then always use that as an inspiration as well. But at the same time, like I said, I have to protect myself from it becoming the only thing, because that would just fully weigh me down.
It's so interesting you say that, because of just thinking about my own personal journey as well. So my dad died by suicide when I was 6 years old. And when I was 6, I didn't really comprehend what that meant. And it was only as I grew up that, I started to understand, okay, the magnitude of, what he'd done and, how he was feeling. And, that time I said, but like in my early 20s, like I didn't actually know it, but I was grieving. Mm-hmm. I was still grieving through that point. So the things where I like cover myself with all these materialistic things or think that I'm, succeeding at life, it wasn't till late 20s, early 30s, and as well post-COVID, got in touch with Kelly's Heroes for the first time.
Wow.
Because I was like, this isn't life.
Yeah.
Like this isn't, like I had this massive burden because I look a lot like my dad and I act quite a lot like him. I'm quite, the Joker and all this sort of stuff. Like I felt a lot of pressure from my family that I was my dad. Mm-hmm. And then I started thinking, like, I'm getting to the same age that he was. And then I was like, oh my God, is this going to happen to me? Am I following that exact same path? Because I feel like I have to emulate him so much that's when I got in contact with Kelly's Heroes. So I started off, end of 2020, going to their bereavement groups.
Yeah.
As a person who lost someone by suicide. Yes, it was 20 odd years before, but it was only a light bulb moment that was like, I need to do something about this.
Yeah.
And like your story of what you're saying and how you've transformed, like it just struck me. That's the same thing that I went through. And it's only now, sort of 5 years down the line, in that time, I've actually got over my grief. Well, I say get over. I mean, you can't get over, but I know how to manage my grief. I understand how I feel about that. And I also understand the separation between who I am as a person and who my dad was as well.
Wow.
And like now, nearly 5 years on, I now facilitate those groups as a leader. I've decided to, take up these podcasts. I go to every event that Sherry will invite me to, because I just, like you said, I've normalised talking about suicide now. So I'm very comfortable in that. And I'm very comfortable to, say the S word that people don't like saying. And yeah, there's a lot of people that are receptive to it. But there's also a lot of people, like you said, those two dads at the football pitch, they do walk away. And it's like, it will never put me off, talking about my experience or, just putting an arm around someone and being like, it's okay.
Yeah. Wow.
So the conversation we've had today has been phenomenal. One, because I was like, I'm going to come here, talk to Matt, find out what he's doing. But the whole way through the story, like, I've just heard like my journey as well. Wow. And it's been great. So,
and just to say thank you for sharing that. And obviously I'm so sorry for that, but wow, like well done to you, because that takes guts and courage and a deep vulnerability that, probably the younger version of you would have never ever truly sort of thought you could go on that journey that you've been on, and look at where you are now. And look, again, it's cliche, but the journey's never finished, is it?
No.
And there will be things that knock you back, and there will be things that there's bumps in the road and all those things. But my word, that was that was brilliant to hear. Well done.
I think like the focus now for me is like what actually makes me happy.
Yeah.
Like, do I get up in the morning like happy to do all that sort of stuff? And I think like, you know, hearing some of the stuff where you're saying about, you know, the schools are measured on certain things, whereas like that do the right thing, it's just like you can't measure that sort of stuff. And like it's so lovely to hear about, you know, the driving force that you've been in the local community and affecting so many people. So yeah, it's been lovely to hear everything that you've been doing.
Thank you.
So we've had like a really open and raw conversation, which I wasn't expecting. Like I said, I came here to listen to what you were saying, and it feels like our armour's been dropped, and we're both, you know, just very open and having that great conversation. Yeah, I just want to take some last thoughts from you about, you know, if there's anything that you've come across, etc., about, you know, if it's quite scary to come and be like, oh, come and do a podcast to talk about these things. Like, is there any sort of stuff that you've like read about previously or looked at that's kind of, you know, helped you come to this chat today to just be like, okay, there's no point in, you know, hiding behind anything or, you know, giving a very polished answer. It's just about actually being authentic.
Well, authenticity is a really interesting one as well, by the way. But firstly, I also didn't know what to expect today, and you come in with a bit of trepidation and quite nervous about how the conversation is going to go. And we just said it briefly, like we actually forgot that there were any other people in the room. For about 15 minutes, we've lost ourselves in a very connected and sort of deep, authentic conversation. So around, you mentioned armour, and you know we've dropped ours, and that's been really clear. So something I speak about regularly is around this idea that so many children in our schools, both primary schools and secondary schools and special schools and any type of education establishment, they wear some sort of armour. They're probably guarded, they're probably quite closed, they're probably really afraid to let their barriers down. And I think for a lot of young people, that armour has grown thicker and stronger over the past few years for lots of the reasons that we talked around. And, you know, the COVID pandemic, but also social media, different pressures, you know, so, and it's a different type of armour that we don't truly understand. I take a lot of inspiration and learning, I suppose, from a wonderful American lady, a lady called Brené Brown, who she's written several books. She speaks on many podcasts. She is really well versed on talking about vulnerability and sort of just how we can be the best versions of ourselves as human beings, but particularly understanding the things that draw us back. This idea that we're perfectly imperfect, etc. You know, the idea that vulnerability is actually a strength, and you know, the fact that we have to be courageous and show integrity, all of those things. But I'm just going to quote something that she said in her great book, Dare to Lead. She said that, linked to schools, what we can do and what we are ethically called to do is create a space in our schools and classrooms where students can walk in and for that day or hour, take off the crushing weight of their armour, hang it on a rack and open their heart to truly being seen. We should never underestimate the benefit of a child having a place to belong, even one where they can take off their armour. It can and often does change the trajectory of their life. And I think the point around that is, when we trace right back to the conversation around supporting and training adults in schools to open their minds up to the realisms of the challenges that our young people face, and have that skill set to be able to ask a direct question about, you know, why a child is behaving in a certain way, why a child might be having suicidal thoughts, why a child might be self-harming, and be confident to do that. If we can give children a space where they can really be seen and feel like they're being heard, then that surely is our only job as a school community.
That's a really beautiful message. Sadly, we've come to the end of the podcast. I mean, we've had such a great conversation today. Just before we do actually leave, I just wanted to know, like, from all the things we've talked about today and, your experience as well, if there's like one key piece of advice that you could give to people out there in terms of, or resiliency or well-being, like what would that be?
It's a bit of a strained link, but I'm going to go with it. So, the best bit of advice I would give is to accept that we live in a world of paradoxes. So everything is a contradiction. You can have that and you can have that. So the professional coach that I work with at the moment, who is he gets me thinking in a really different way. He will help me to understand the extremes of the spectrum. There's one extreme to the other. The reality of my work, for instance, the one end of the spectrum is that, and I said to you, I'm the glue. So I'm built for holding people together. That's my super strength. So one extreme is, this organization wouldn't run without me. I'm the most important, I'm the glue, blah, blah, blah. Versus the other extreme on the spectrum is I could get sacked tomorrow.
Yeah.
And there's a paradox there, because both of them actually quite rightly are true. I hope I don't get sacked tomorrow. But also I know the organization functions perfectly well without me.
Yeah.
But those extremes are really important. In the education sphere, the paradox of high level accountability with exam results at one side versus supporting young people's mental health and well-being and making sure they're psychologically fit. Actually, you can have both. But there are people out there who would have you believe that you have to. It's one or the other. If you focus on mental health and well-being and supporting students to be psychologically well, etc., then that's going to be to the detriment of their exam results. It isn't. It's not a contradiction. But on the face of it, it can be a complete paradox. Yeah. And the final kind of applied example, I suppose, is this idea of, and I've said it several times, as human beings, we mess up, we get things wrong. We are perfectly imperfect. So you're going to fail, but also you're going to get it right.
Yeah.
And accepting that as well is probably my biggest piece of advice.
So accept that acceptance of failure, and also learning to fail fast as well. Because there's nothing...
There's this idea,
perfectly imperfect.
It's this idea of, and again, I don't want to keep throwing cliches out, but if we can reframe failure as feedback, okay, so I've got that wrong, but I'm going to take some feedback from that in order to make myself better for the next time. If the mantra is that I'm going to do better today than I did yesterday, and if we all have that viewpoint, then surely the world's going to be a better place.
I couldn't agree more. Well, that comes to the end of the podcast. I can't thank you anymore for joining us on the Voice of Hope podcast. It's been an absolute amazing session. And thank you so much for all of your insights and being very open with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Cheers.